They ridiculed her Earth armor. Part 1, The Outsider. The transport ship landed at the military academy just as the twin suns began to set. Vance grabbed her equipment case and walked down the ramp with the other new cadets. She was the only human among them. The academy was massive. Its towers reached toward the purple sky like fingers of polished stone. Thousands of cadets from 100 different species trained here. Only the best soldiers in the galaxy earned a place at. For most species, getting accepted was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. Followed the crowd toward the orientation hall. She could feel the stares. Humans were rare in hegemony space. Most aliens considered Earth a small, unimportant world that had only been contacted 60 years ago. To them, humans were newcomers, primitives, barely worth noticing. She did not care about the stares. She had expected them. What she had not expected was the laughter. It started when the cadets began unpacking their combat armor for inspection. All around her, young warriors pulled out incredible suits of protection. The cadets wore crystalline plate that glowed with inner light. The displayed living metal that moved and shifted like liquid silver. They had phase-weave suits that flickered in and out of visibility. Then opened her case. Her armor was black metal, scratched and by time. It had no power source that anyone could see. No holographic displays. No elegant curves or beautiful designs. It looked like something pulled from ancient wreckage. A tall cadet walked over. His name was Kel, and his family was famous throughout the hegemony for manufacturing the most advanced combat suits in known space. He looked at its armor and started laughing. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Did you find that in a garbage pit?" Other cadets gathered around. They pointed at the old armor and made jokes. One called it pre-contact junk. Another suggested it was decoration from a dead species, picked up the chest piece and turned it over in his hands, still laughing. "This is what Earth sends too," he said. "No wonder your species is irrelevant. You cannot even build proper armor." Said nothing. She simply took the chest piece back from his hands. Her movements were calm and slow. If the mockery bothered her, she did not show it. "Maybe she cannot afford real equipment," someone suggested. "Humans are poor, yes. A backwards people still recovering from some disaster." This made the crowd laugh harder. Ran her fingers over a faded symbol on the chest piece. It was a strange insignia that none of them recognized. A black circle with 3 claw marks cutting through it. Simple and crude compared to the elegant crests the other cadets wore. "Do you have nothing to say, human?" asked. He seemed annoyed that she would not react to his insults. "Have you no pride at all?" Looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and steady. "I have plenty of pride," she said quietly. "I just do not waste it on people who do not matter." The crowd went silent for a moment. His face twisted with anger. Before he could respond, a horn sounded across the orientation hall. The cadets scrambled to form lines for the official welcome ceremony. High above the hall, on a balcony reserved for senior instructors, an old warrior watched the new arrivals. His name was, and he was a. His species had 4 eyes, thick skin, and that stretched for centuries. Was 317 years old, though he looked barely middle-aged by standards. He had served as combat instructor for over a century. He had trained thousands of soldiers. He had seen countless cadets arrive with fancy armor and big egos. Most of them learned humility quickly. Some never learned at all. But as 4 eyes moved across the crowd of new cadets, something made him freeze. His hands gripped the balcony railing so hard that the metal cracked beneath his fingers. His aide, a young named, noticed immediately. "Instructor, is something wrong?" Did not answer. He could not answer. His eyes were locked on a human girl standing near the back of the formation. She was wearing armor that should not exist. Armor that he had seen only once before, 200 years ago, during the worst war in galactic history. The insignia on her chest. The black circle with 3 claw marks. He knew that symbol. He had watched soldiers wearing that symbol do things that still haunted his nightmares. "That is impossible," he whispered. His voice was barely audible. "That armor, that insignia, everyone who wore those colors is supposed to be dead. They were all supposed to be dead." Looked confused. "Sir, which cadet are you talking about?" Pointed a shaking finger toward. "The human. Look at her armor. Do you recognize it?" Studied the girl for a long moment. "No, sir. It looks like salvage. Primitive equipment, probably ceremonial. Why should I recognize it?" "No," said slowly. "No, you would not. You are too young. That war ended 2 centuries before you were born." He paused, struggling to control his emotions. "But I remember. I remember everything about the Silence War, and I remember what those soldiers did to end it." The Silence War. Had heard the name before, but only in whispers. Details about that ancient conflict were classified. Most people knew only that something terrible had happened before the hegemony was founded. What does a human cadet have to do with a war that ended 200 years ago? Finally released his grip on the ruined railing. He straightened his uniform and turned toward the exit. His mind was racing with questions he did not know how to answer. "I need to check the archives," he said. "There are files I have not accessed in a very long time, files that I hoped would never become relevant again." "Sir, what is going on? What was the Silence War?" Stopped at the doorway. He looked back at his young aide with eyes that had seen too much death, too much horror, too much sacrifice. "The Silence War was the conflict that almost destroyed this galaxy," he said quietly. 17 species were nearly exterminated. Entire star systems were burned to ash. And at the end, when all hope seemed lost, something impossible happened. Something that the hegemony has worked very hard to erase from history. "What happened?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Humanity happened. And if that girl is wearing what I think she is wearing, then the dead are not as dead as we believed." He walked away without another word, leaving alone on the balcony, staring down at a human girl in old armor who had no idea what storm was about to begin. They ridiculed her Earth armor Part 2, The Weight of History. Had not entered the classified archives in over 50 years. The security systems recognized his biometrics and let him pass through 7 layers of protection before he reached the deepest vault. Here, the hegemony kept its darkest secrets. Here, the truth about the Silence War was buried. He sat at a console and began searching. His old hands trembled slightly as he typed. The files he wanted were protected by the highest classification level in the hegemony. Even accessing them would trigger alerts to the Council of Species. He did not care. He needed to understand. The first file opened. It was a report from 207 years ago, marked with red symbols that meant never declassify. The title was simple: First Contact Species Designation, Human. Began reading, and his blood ran cold. Humans had not been contacted 60 years ago. That was a lie. The truth was far more complicated and far more terrible. Humanity's first encounter with alien life happened during the Silence War, when a colony ship called the Advent Hope stumbled into the middle of the conflict. The Advent Hope carried 12,000 human refugees. They had left Earth searching for a new home among the stars. Instead, they found themselves trapped between the hegemony and the K's dominion. The K's closed his eyes as memories flooded back. The K's were monsters. They did not conquer other species. They consumed them. They absorbed the genetic material of their victims and used it to improve themselves. They had devoured 100 civilizations before the Silence War began. When the K's discovered the Advent Hope, they saw easy prey. 12,000 soft, primitive creatures with no weapons, no fleet, no allies. The hegemony refused to help. Why would they waste resources protecting an irrelevant species? But something unexpected happened, something that changed the course of the war. Scrolled through the files. He found images of burning ships, reports of impossible battles, and then he found what he was looking for, the protocol. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard whispers of the during the war. Everyone had, but he never knew the full truth. The hegemony had made sure of that. According to the files, when the humans realized no one would save them, they decided to save themselves. They studied the Ks. They learned their biology, their psychology, their weaknesses, and then they did something that no species had ever done before. They built themselves into weapons. There was a volunteer force of humans who underwent training so brutal that only 1 in 20 survived. They did not learn elegant combat techniques or advanced tactics. They learned how to kill Ks. That was their only purpose. That was their only goal. Their armor was forged from the hulls of destroyed K ships. The metal was treated with processes that made it invisible to K's senses. They could walk among the monsters without being detected. They could strike from the darkness and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. Found a video file and opened it. The footage was old and damaged, but he could still see what was happening. Soldiers in black armor were moving through a K's breeding facility. They worked in perfect silence. They showed no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. In 3 hours, they killed over 8,000 Ks. Not a single human died. Turned off the video. His hands were shaking badly now. He remembered hearing rumors during the war. Stories of ghost soldiers who appeared from nowhere. Whispers of a species so terrifying that the Ks had started avoiding entire sectors of space just to escape them. He had thought they were legends, propaganda created to boost morale, but they were real. They were all real. And now, a young human woman was wearing that same armor in his academy. The next morning, watched the cadets begin their first training exercises. He paid special attention to Vance. She had changed into her black armor, and the other cadets gave her a wide distance. Not because they respected her, but because they were still mocking her. They thought the distance was an insult. They were wrong. The first exercise was simple combat sparring. Cadets would fight one-on-one until the instructor called a stop. Kel immediately volunteered to face. He wanted to humiliate her in front of everyone. "This will be quick," announced loudly. His living metal armor shifted and flowed around his body, forming blades and shields as needed. "Try not to cry, human." Said nothing. She simply raised her fists and waited. The instructor signaled the start of the match. Rushed forward with incredible speed, his armor forming a massive blade aimed at its chest. It was a move that had won him dozens of matches against other cadets. Stepped to the side. Her hand shot out and grabbed his arm. She twisted her body in a sharp motion and suddenly was flying through the air. He crashed into the ground hard enough to crack the stone floor. Before he could recover, was on top of him. Her knee pressed against his throat. Her fist was raised, ready to strike. The match had lasted 3 seconds. The training hall went completely silent. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Kel, heir to the greatest armor manufacturing family in the hegemony, had been defeated by a human in primitive salvage armor. Stood up and walked away without a word. She did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She simply returned to her position and waited for the next exercise. Watched from the observation platform. He noticed things that the other cadets had missed. His fighting style was not elegant or beautiful. It was brutal and efficient. She did not fight to win matches. She fought to end threats. Every movement was designed to cause maximum damage in minimum time. This was not sport fighting. This was combat designed for survival. Combat designed to kill things that should not be. That night approached in the empty training hall. She was practicing alone, moving through combat forms that he did not recognize. When she noticed him, she stopped and bowed respectfully. "Instructor," she said, "is something wrong?" Pulled out a small holographic projector. He activated it, and an image appeared in the air between them. It showed soldiers in armor identical to hers. They were standing on a battlefield covered with Kay's bodies. His face did not change, but saw her hands tighten into fists. "I thought all copies of that footage were destroyed," said quietly. "I kept this one hidden for 200 years. I never understood why. Maybe some part of me knew this day would come." He looked into her eyes. "Who are you? Who gave you that armor?" Was silent for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched the insignia on her chest, the black circle with 3 claw marks. "My grandmother," she said finally. "She was 16 when she volunteered for she survived the war. She passed this armor to my mother and my mother passed it to me." "That is impossible. The hegemony eliminated all survivors. They erased every trace of what happened." Smiled, but there was no joy in it. "The hegemony tried, but they never understood humans. They never understood that we do not forget, and we do not forgive." She paused and looked at the hologram of those ancient soldiers. "My grandmother told me stories, Instructor. Stories about what humanity did to survive. Stories about what we became to end the war. Would you like to hear them?" Nodded slowly. He had spent 2 centuries trying to forget the Silence War. Now he realized that forgetting was no longer possible. "Yes," he said, "I think it is time I learned the truth." They ridiculed her Earth armor, Part 3, the truth of the sat across from in his private quarters. The room was simple and bare, like the quarters of a soldier who never truly stopped fighting. She looked at the old and began to speak. "When the Advent Hope was attacked," she said, "my grandmother was just a child. She watched the K's tear through the outer sections of the ship. She watched them consume her parents. They did not just kill, they absorbed. The K's believed that eating a creature gave them its strength, its memories, its essence." Nodded slowly. He remembered the horror of facing the K's in battle. The way they moved, the sounds they made, the absolute hunger in their eyes. "The survivors retreated to the inner sections of the ship," continued. "About 8,000 humans were left. They sent distress signals to every frequency. The hegemony responded with a simple message. You are not our concern. We cannot spare resources for a doomed species." "I remember that decision," said quietly. "I was a young officer then. Many of us disagreed, but the council was afraid. They thought helping you would draw more K's attention. It did not matter, the K's were already coming. We had nowhere to run, no allies, no weapons. We should have died like all the other species the K's had consumed." Paused. Her eyes grew distant, as if she was seeing events from long ago. But something changed. A scientist named made a discovery. She had been studying K's biology from the bodies left behind after attacks. She found that they had weaknesses, very specific weaknesses that no one had ever noticed because no one had ever survived long enough to study them. "What kind of weaknesses?" "Their senses. The K's hunted by detecting neural activity. They could sense the electrical signals of a thinking brain from great distances. That was how they always found their prey, but discovered that certain materials, when treated correctly, could block those signals. She found that the K's had a psychological weakness too. They had never faced a species that hunted them back. The concept of being prey was completely foreign to their minds." Leaned forward. This was information that had never been in any hegemony file. "The survivors held a meeting," said. "They had 2 choices. They could hide and wait to die, or they could fight. Not just fight to survive, but fight to win." Stood before them and explained her plan. It was brutal. It was horrifying. It would require sacrifices that most civilized species would never consider. What was the plan? Create soldiers, not ordinary soldiers, weapons in human form. People willing to become something other than human if that was what victory required. They called it the protocol. Touched her armor. 2,800 volunteers stepped forward, men and women. Some were soldiers, most were not. Teachers, engineers, farmers, children who had lost everyone they loved. They all volunteered knowing that the training would probably kill them. Only 1 in 20 survived, whispered. He had read that in the files. Correct. The training lasted 2 years. They learned to control their fear completely. They learned to suppress their neural activity so the Ks could not detect them. They learned every weakness, every vulnerability, every pressure point that could cause a K's pain. They studied K's language so they could speak to their enemies, not to negotiate, to terrorize. His 4 eyes widened. Terrorize the Ks. Nodded. The Ks had never known fear. They were apex predators. They had consumed 100 species without resistance, but the changed that. They struck from shadows. They poisoned breeding pools. They left messages written in K's blood. They learned to move through K's ships like ghosts, killing silently, disappearing before anyone knew they were there. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the academy grounds. My grandmother told me about her first mission. She was 16 years old. Her team infiltrated a K's command vessel. They killed every single K's on board, over 300 of them. Then they broadcast a message to the entire K's fleet, a message in perfect K's language. What did it say? Turned to face him. Her voice dropped low. It said, "We are humans. We are coming for you. We will never stop. We will never tire. We will never forgive. Run if you want. Hide if you can. But know this, wherever you go, we will find you. Whatever you do, we will end you. You taught us what it means to be prey. Now we will teach you." Felt a chill run through his old bones. He had fought the K's for decades. He had lost friends, family, entire units to their hunger. But he had never imagined fighting them like this, with their own tactics, with their own cruelty turned against them. It worked, said simply. The K's began avoiding sectors where had been spotted. They started taking losses they had never experienced before. For the first time in their history, K's commanders were afraid to send their warriors into battle. I remember rumors, admitted. We heard stories of ghost soldiers. We thought they were just stories. They were not stories. The fought for 11 years. 2,800 volunteers became only 186 survivors. But those survivors killed more K's than the entire hegemony fleet combined. Stared at her. The numbers were impossible. And yet, looking at her armor, looking at her eyes, he believed every word. The war ended because of us, said. Not because of hegemony tactics or superior firepower. The K's surrendered because they were afraid. They came to not the hegemony, and begged for mercy. They promised to stop consuming other species. They promised to retreat to their own territory and never leave. They just wanted the hunting to end. What did the say? Smiled grimly. My grandmother was there. She told me they almost said no. After everything the K's had done, mercy seemed impossible, but they were tired, so tired. 11 years of constant war, 11 years of watching friends die. They agreed to peace, but with conditions. The K's would be monitored forever. Any violation would mean complete extermination. The K's agreed to everything. She turned back to face fully. The hegemony was horrified. They were not grateful. They looked at what humanity had done, the methods we used, the weapons we became, and they were disgusted. They called us barbarians. They said our tactics were crimes against civilization. They decided that the galaxy should never know that the Great War was ended by a species of refugees using nothing but determination and terror. So they erased you, said. They tried. They relocated the survivors to Earth. They destroyed records. They rewrote history. They made humanity into a primitive species that was only recently contacted. They thought they could bury the truth forever. Touched her armor again. But they did not understand us. Humans do not forget. We pass the truth down through generations. This armor has been in my family for 200 years. It is not a trophy. It is a promise that we will always remember what we sacrificed, and what we are capable of becoming if we must. Sat in silence for a long time. Everything he thought he knew about the Silence War was wrong. Everything the galaxy believed about humanity was a lie. Finally, he spoke. "Why are you here? Why come to the academy where everyone will mock you and question you?" His eyes met his. They were hard and cold and old beyond her years. Because someone needs to remember. The hegemony believes humanity is weak. They believe we are primitive newcomers. They need to understand the truth, not as a threat, as a warning. A warning. We did not enjoy what we became during the Silence War. We do not want to become that again. But if the galaxy ever faces another threat like the K's, humanity will do what must be done. We will sacrifice everything. We will become anything. We will not stop until the threat is ended. She paused. The motto was simple. We are the ones who remain. We carry the dead so the living may be free. I carry my grandmother's armor because I carry her memory, her sacrifice, her pain, and I will not let the galaxy forget what that sacrifice meant. They ridiculed her Earth armor Part 4, the challenge. Kel was not used to losing. He was the heir to the most powerful military manufacturing family in the hegemony. He had trained with the best instructors. He had worn the most advanced armor ever created, and he had been defeated by a human in 3 seconds. The humiliation burned inside him like acid. For weeks after that first sparring match, watched closely. He noticed that she kept to herself. She never explained her armor. She never talked about her past. Her personnel file was restricted in ways that made no sense for a primitive Earth species. Something was wrong, something was hidden, and was determined to discover what. He used his family connections to access systems that should have been locked to cadets. He spent night after night digging through classified databases. Most of the files were blocked, but he found fragments, pieces of a puzzle that slowly came together. He found images of a burning world. He found references to something called protocol. He found 200 years of carefully hidden lies. When he finally understood what he had discovered, faced a choice. He could keep this secret and live with his defeat, or he could expose the truth and destroy completely. His pride made the decision for him. The next morning, every screen in the academy lit up with a broadcast, stood in the central courtyard, surrounded by cadets from every species. He had prepared his presentation carefully. "Fellow cadets," he announced loudly, "I have discovered something that the hegemony has hidden from all of us, something about the human among us, something about her armor." Was in the crowd. She watched with calm eyes, showing no surprise. "This human claims to be from a peaceful primitive world," continued. "But she wears the armor of war criminals, soldiers who committed acts so terrible that the hegemony erased them from history." He activated a holographic display. Fragments of old footage appeared, blurry images of soldiers in black armor, reports marked with warnings about classified content. 200 years ago, during a war that almost destroyed our galaxy, a group of humans became monsters. They called themselves the. They did not fight with honor. They did not follow rules of combat. They used terror and cruelty to break their enemies. They were no better than the creatures they fought. The crowd murmured. Cadets stared at with new eyes. "This human wears their symbol," declared, pointing at the black circle with 3 claw marks on its armor. "She claims their legacy. She is the descendant of war criminals, and she should not be allowed in this academy." The murmuring grew louder. Some cadets called for expulsion. Others looked frightened, as if she might attack them at any moment. Stood perfectly still through all of it. She did not defend herself. She did not try to explain. But then another voice cut through the noise. "That is enough." Everyone turned. Instructor walked through the crowd. His ancient face was hard as stone. His 4 eyes blazed with an intensity that made even step back. "You have discovered fragments of truth," said Tu. "Congratulations. But you understand nothing about what you found. Sit down and let me teach you." Hesitated. "Instructor, I was just." "I said sit down." The commandant's voice was absolute. Sat. Turned to face the entire crowd. Hundreds of cadets from dozens of species watched him in confused silence. "You want to know about the Silence War?" asked. "Fine, I will tell you. I was there. I fought in that war for 60 years. I watched friends die. I watched entire species get erased from existence. I saw horrors that would break your young minds." He began to walk through the crowd. Cadets moved aside to let him pass. The K's dominion was not just an enemy. They were a force of nature. They consumed everything in their path. They had destroyed 100 civilizations before we even knew they existed. When they came for us, we thought it was the end of everything. Stopped near, he looked at her armor with something like reverence. Then the humans arrived, not as warriors, as refugees. 12,000 people in a single colony ship looking for a new home. They found war instead. The K's attacked them. The hegemony refused to help. Everyone expected them to die like all the others. His voice grew stronger. But they did not die. They fought back, not with fleets or advanced technology. They had none of those things. They fought with something we had forgotten existed: pure, absolute, unstoppable determination. He turned to face the crowd. "You mock her armor. Let me tell you what that armor represents. It represents a species that refused to accept extinction. A species that looked at the most terrifying enemy the galaxy had ever known and decided that the enemy should be afraid of them instead." Silence, complete silence. "They were not war criminals," continued. "They were survivors. They did what they had to do because no one else could, because no one else would. They sacrificed their peace, their innocence, their humanity so that others could live." He pointed at, "You call them monsters. The K's had consumed 100 species without resistance. They believed they were invincible. That proved them wrong. They made the K's so afraid that the great devourers surrendered, not to our fleets, not to our technology, to 186 exhausted humans who had nothing left except the will to keep fighting." His voice dropped low. The hegemony was ashamed, not of the K's, of themselves. They had refused to help humanity when humanity needed them, and then humanity saved them anyway. They could not accept that debt, so they erased the truth. They made humanity into a joke, a primitive species barely worth noticing. He looked around at the stunned cadets. "Every species in this academy owes their existence to the... Your ancestors survived because human soldiers were willing to become something terrible so that the galaxy could live. That is not a crime. That is the greatest sacrifice in recorded history." Finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried across the silent courtyard. "I do not need you to defend me, Instructor, but thank you." She stepped forward and faced the crowd. "My grandmother was 16 when she volunteered for the 16 years old. She had watched her parents get consumed by the K's. She had nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. She volunteered because someone had to." Touched the insignia on her chest. "She fought for 11 years. She did things that gave her nightmares until the day she died. She never talked about the war without crying. But she gave me this armor, not as a trophy, as a reminder." Her eyes swept across the cadets. "Humanity's gift is not strength or intelligence or technology. Our gift is simple. We do not stop, ever, for anything. When everything is lost, when hope is gone, when the universe says we should give up, we keep going. That is what the K's learned. That is what my grandmother taught me. That is what you should remember." She looked directly at. "You called me a descendant of war criminals. Fine. I am also the descendant of heroes, people who saved your ancestors while your ancestors did nothing to help them. If that makes you uncomfortable, I do not care. The truth is the truth." Turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her in silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, cadets began to leave. Many of them looked at the retreating figure with different eyes, not mockery, not fear. Respect. Watched her go. Then he turned to who still sat frozen in place. "You wanted to humiliate her," said quietly. "Instead, you gave her a chance to show everyone who she really is. I hope you learned something from this, cadet, because I certainly did." He walked away, leaving alone with the weight of everything he had heard. They ridiculed her Earth armor Part 5, Legacy. The weeks after's failed accusation changed everything at the Academy. Officials from the Hegemony Council arrived to investigate. They asked questions. They reviewed records. They tried to find a way to punish someone for revealing classified information. But too many people had heard the truth. Too many cadets had started asking their own questions. In the end, the investigation quietly closed without action. There were too many powerful species who owed their survival to what they had done. No one wanted to examine that debt too closely. Remained at the Academy, she continued her training. She continued to defeat opponents who underestimated her, but things were different now. Cadets no longer mocked her armor. Some avoided her entirely, still unsure what to think. Others watched her with curiosity and growing respect. One evening, approached her in the training hall. Was practicing alone, moving through combat forms that seemed ancient and brutal compared to the elegant techniques taught at the Academy. "May I speak with you?" asked. His voice was quiet. The arrogance that had defined him was gone. Stopped and turned to face him. She did not say yes, but she did not say no. "I have been thinking," said slowly, "about what Instructor said, about what you said. I cannot stop thinking about it." He paused, struggling to find words. "How?" he finally asked. "How did your people endure that and still function? 11 years of war, watching friends die, becoming something they never wanted to be. How do you survive that?" Studied him for a long moment. She saw genuine confusion in his eyes. This was not a trick or an insult. He truly wanted to understand. "Because we had each other," she said simply. "They did not fight for glory or conquest. They did not fight because they wanted to. They fought because there were children on the refugee ships who deserved a future. They fought because giving up meant letting the K's win." She sat down on a training bench. After a moment, sat beside her. "My grandmother told me that the hardest part was not the fighting. The hardest part was staying human. They trained themselves to suppress emotion, to ignore fear, to act like machines. But they never forgot why they were fighting. Every night before every mission, they would share stories about the people they loved, the families they remembered, the futures they were protecting." Listened in silence. "That is how they survived," continued. "Not by becoming monsters, by holding on to what made them human even while they did monstrous things. Every kill was for someone they loved. Every sacrifice had meaning." "I have never thought about war that way," admitted. "In my family, we talk about honor and glory and legacy. We never talk about sacrifice, not real sacrifice." "Most species do not," said. "They think of war as a contest, something with winners and losers and rules. But real war is not like that. Real war is survival, and survival does not care about honor." She touched her armor. They understood that. They gave up everything so that others would not have to. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be remembered. Nodded slowly. He did not apologize for what he had done. Maybe he could not find the words, but something in his face had changed. The boy who had mocked her primitive armor was gone. In his place was someone who had seen a larger truth and was still processing what it meant. Word of story spread beyond the Academy. With permission from, began teaching an unofficial seminar about the philosophy. It was not about tactics or weapons. It was about finding strength when everything was lost, about continuing to fight when victory seemed impossible. Cadets from across the Academy began attending. Many of them had mocked in those first days. Now they sat in silence and listened to stories about humans who had refused to die. They called the seminar The Human Way. 6 months later, was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for the senior class. No human had ever been given such an honor in the history of the Academy. When she walked to the podium in her grandmother's armor, 1,000 cadets watched in respectful silence. She did not give an inspirational speech. She did not talk about victory or glory or the future. Instead, she pulled out a small data pad. "I want to read you some names," she said. Her voice was calm and steady. "These are the names of every human who served in the. There were 2,847 of them. 2,612 died before the war ended." She began reading. The scientist who discovered the K's weaknesses. She died in the first year of fighting. The first soldier to kill a K's queen. He died protecting a refugee ship full of children. Sarah, she led the mission that destroyed the K's central hive. She never made it out. Name after name, story after story, read without emotion, without pausing, without stopping. The audience sat in stunned silence as she continued. David Park, James Obi, Santos. The reading took 3 hours, did not rush. She gave every name the respect it deserved. Some cadets cried, others sat with clenched fists. No one left. When she finally finished, looked up from the data pad, her grandmother's name had been in that list. Age 16 when she volunteered, age 27 when the war ended, one of the 186 survivors. Touched the insignia on her chest, the black circle with 3 claw marks, the symbol of the. "We are the ones who remain," she said, her voice echoing across the silent hall. "We carry the dead so the living may be free." For a long moment nothing happened. Then slowly a single cadet stood, then another, then a dozen. Within seconds every person in the hall was on their feet. The applause began quietly and grew until it shook the walls. It was the first standing ovation ever given to a human in hegemony space. Watched from the back of the hall, his old eyes were wet with tears he had not shed in centuries. He thought about the young soldiers he had seen in that ancient footage. The black armor, the terrible efficiency, the absolute refusal to surrender. They had been erased from history, forgotten by a galaxy that owed them everything. But now, finally, they were being remembered. In the darkest corners of known space, news of the ceremony spread. The name was spoken again for the first time in 2 centuries. Stories began to emerge. Historians started asking questions. The carefully constructed lies of the hegemony began to crack. And somewhere in the deep void, ancient K survivors heard the whispers. They heard the old name spoken with reverence instead of fear. They remembered what it meant. They remembered the ghost soldiers who had broken their empire and taught them the meaning of terror. They had hoped the galaxy would forget. They were wrong. On the Academy grounds, Vance removed her helmet and felt the cool evening air on her face. She thought about her grandmother, who had been just a child when the war began, who had survived 11 years of horror and then raised a family and passed down her armor and her stories. Had never wanted glory. She had just wanted people to remember, to understand what humanity had sacrificed so that the galaxy could live. Now finally they would. Looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there her grandmother was watching. Somewhere out there 2,612 ghosts were finally at peace. "We did it, grandmother," she whispered. "They remember now, they all remember." The twin suns set over the Academy, and for the first time in 200 years, humanity's true legacy burned bright across the galaxy.